Feel like these patch notes are gonna be a letdown? Yeah, sure. Who's ready to be disappointed? I know I am. There's probably not gonna be that many changes. I expect probably like literally 3 changes. Turkish patch notes are out. I've been preparing for this. I know like 4 different words in this language. 1.5 Yamat Notlari Laboratovar. 1.5 It's not just these. This is a weird one. Well, see you guys in another 2 weeks. Okay, I'll ignore this one for now. Let's start with this one. This has to be a joke and the real patch notes aren't out. This befuddles me. What does that mean? Befuddles. Define befuddles. Make someone unable to think clearly. I'm fairly befuddled. So like, Solitary Monk. It's a pretty good card. Don't get me wrong. They didn't nerf Monk in English? Wait. Is the Turkish one just a joke? Wait. Maybe it was a mistranslation. Wait, what? Wait. There's just no picture for Monk. Oh god. Okay, let's read it. We do have the ability to read these now. Monk's base stats and keyword are the strongest in the game, with an appropriately interesting drawback to craft your deck around. Used effectively, she's a threat that both pushes damage and defends above her cost threshold, while her recall ability can be mitigated or turns to your benefit. We've seen this raw power used too effectively in many different styles of decks, so we're choosing to adjust her damage output rather than utility to focus her more on dedicated strategies. So to be fair, this is likely a good change. As funny as it is, I think that the Solitary Monk change is certainly better than the Pilfered Goods change. Certainly. I think like not even close. The big thing is that just in terms of like the current meta environment, it feels fairly like kind of like quite low priority. I don't think that the Monk change really is a problem solving solution. What I see here is almost certainly the consequence of like some data-driven process. I'm sure Monk has a really high statistical win rate across the board, and like the on-play win rate and like the, you know, turn on 3 versus like later, you know, there's a lot of different stats you might use as a developer, right? There's like win rate in deck, win rate per copy in deck, win rate per play, or win rate per amount of card drawn, or win rate, you know, there's many different stats, and it's super important. And so like depending on like where we're doing the stats, it's very possible for, you know, the stats to basically make a Monk look really insane. I think the biggest issue here is that at the end of the day, going with that sort of like process, and I've personally really never liked data-driven processes. I'll point out, I don't know, like, you know, some of you guys who are watching this, I'm sure played Gwent, and this is actually a large part of the reason why Gwent sort of like kind of died, which a lot of people aren't really like talking about per se, but the development process of Gwent was overly data-driven. And you'll see this in like a lot of the psychological aspects. Like, if you'll remember the coin flip issue, you know, it was like 2 years that the coin flip was the way it was. Literally the entirety of Gwent's lifetime, they only fixed the coin flip after Gwent died. And the biggest reason that that issue went ignored was because statistically it was fine. And that's usually not a great sign, I think. Overall, I will say this change is a positive one. Like, the Solitary Monk direction is a positive one. This card probably did eventually need to get changed, and this is the best change for it, actually. Like, I think this card is still viable. I think that without changing the elusive keyword, they did eventually need to do probably this. It does incentivize some somewhat unique, also somewhat degenerate play patterns, those being stuff like double float, which they obviously want to be possible as an idea, but, you know, they do want to limit its prevalence as, you know, as a strategy. And obviously, if you're going to nerf Monk, nerfing 1 pointer for attack is almost certainly the best way to do it. It's not a change that I disagree with. It's just like, with the context of the current meta, it is almost certainly going to end up changing nothing. And that's, I guess that's kind of like the issue here. It's like, it's not like it's a negative change, per se, but it is both a band-aid solution as well as a sort of like ineffective band-aid solution. Then we've got Pilfered Goods. And let's talk a little bit about this. So Pilfered Goods goes from 2 to 3. This was a concept that people did complain about a bit more. My thesis here is that I'm going to link these two changes with the same description that I just gave. A, ineffective for the current meta, and B, also seeming much more like a band-aid solution, right? I don't know if I dislike this specific change, right? So, in terms of like the positioning in the current meta, Pilfered Goods is mostly a psychological card, right? It is a card that is frustrating, but largely at this point in time, not like insanely prevalent in the meta. I mean, it fell down a ton, and then it got a bit of a blip up with like Twisted Fate Ezreal. I don't think it really addresses like the meta concerns at this point. So my stance on NAB for about 4 weeks now has been one that this change would actually fall under, which is A, NAB does not need a rework or design tweak. B, NAB is likely in need of some amount of balance tweak. And this change would fall under exactly that purview. The question is this a change that will in particular leave these cards playable? I mean, if like Black Market Merchant was already the stronger card in the relationship, it feels like it could be quite easy to run Merchant without Pilfered Goods now. Like, you didn't really need Pilfered Goods to run Merchant. Monk can't even kill Basilisk now. Yeah, for the current meta, that's a very relevant point. That's like the biggest deal for Monk's position in the current meta. There's nothing really wrong with it. Like Monk, it's a change that is probably overall positive. It's just like very, very strange that these ended up being kind of like the two most highest priority changes. That's kind of like where, and you know, I mean, most of you guys understand that, but I should clarify. Like, these aren't negative changes. I don't think either of them is necessarily like the single best fix, but pretty close. I mean, they're not bad. They're positive. They are solid fixes. It's just like these are cards that I think a little like lower on the, you know, the priority really. 1.5, a couple balance changes that were originally slated for 1.6 as part of our usual monthly balance cadence. Well, we're not going to start making balance updates every patch. We saw an opportunity to quickly turn around a few key changes and get them in your hands, and in the process develop more flexibility around when and how we update cards. As we covered in our Season of Fortune, starting in August, we'll introduce new cards to LoR every 2 months, which means we need to update how we think about and approach balance over the life of the set. We're still considering how exactly we'll adjust, but look for more info on our eventual preview for next season. We also want to stay flexible with how we give our players insight into what we're currently working on. Things like the watch list section in some editions of the patch notes, or the epic card experiences we asked for on Twitter prior to patch 1.4. This time we'd like to provide a brief preview on what we're planning for 1.6. Adjustments to some of Heimerdinger's associated cards. I dislike that. Reworking discard units to increase their satisfaction and usability. That could be good. Adjustments to direct Nexus damage on cheap Noxus units. So that'll be in the camp of probably Disciple and Demolitionist. In theory, possibly Grenadier, but I think that one's unlikely. We hope you enjoy the 2 changes in this patch. We'll see you back in 2 weeks for more. Okay, new mode, Labs. Following the addition of Gauntlet's last patch, Labs are a more experimental take on game modes in LoR. Where Gauntlets are aimed at the competitive experience, Labs are all about variety, experimentation, and maybe a little chaos. You can also try them out with a friend. Friend Challenge now offers a choice between Standard Match and the current. First Lab, ARAM, is available with patch 1.5. Oh shit, this is tomorrow? Oh damn. Unexpected champion matchups and unpredictable outcomes. Rather than building a deck, you'll make choices from a random selection of champions when the game starts. Will start in your hand and generate a deck for you to pilot against your opponent's equally random creation. This isn't for your competitive ass, let's have this. I'm not actually that competitive. I think I'll enjoy this. I like meme formats. I've been like the largest proponent of a Tavern Brawl style format for a while. I'm just looking at this and I'm thinking, well, you choose a random selection of champions. They'll give you high quality buckets, so it'll be fairly similar to the buckets from Expedition in all likelihood, but the champions will start in your hand. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, probably just like pick Zed, right? Because like the fact that it starts in your hands will skew a pretty large imbalance between like different strategies potentially. I mean, I like fun formats. I've nothing wrong with like for fun formats whatsoever. Every patch after 1.5 will include a new or updated lab to replace the previous one. Some labs will experiment with small changes, while others will offer new game modes. I like labs. Labs are actually quite interesting. I like labs a lot more than Gauntlet, even though Gauntlets are quote-unquote more competitive. 2 last points to mention. So it's very common for developers, and Riot has exhibited this, to effectively make changes sort of like based on, you know, future patches we haven't seen yet, right? It's sort of interesting because in theory that could inform the kind of like patch of the future. Like for example, it's extremely possible that the reason why they nerfed Pilfered Goods is because in the next 20 cards we're going to see in 1 month from now, we are going to get some card that interacts with nabbed cards, a la Black Market Merchant, for example. Yeah, I mean, that kind of thing can't be more than a guess, but it's interesting to think about. This is usually, by the way, this is almost always, when you see a change that's, like, really confusing, and the example being, like, if you remember, like, a long time ago, a very long time ago, you might remember Cloud Drinker got nerfed when it looked like a really, really bad card. This was before the game came out. And the reason for that, which was, you know, confirmed by Riot, was specifically that there would be a part of the reason, not necessarily the entire reason, but there would have been eventually in like set 2 or something, some combo that would have made it too strong, and it's just like simpler to nerf it ahead of time so that, you know, it's like people are more used to it at that point, right? Basically what they're saying is that their planned eventual nerf to Heimerdinger will likely affect his associated cards and not himself. Now they say bots in parentheses, which, you know, a common suggestion that I've seen is swap the keywords of the 2-mana bot and the 3-mana bot. So for example, the 2-mana bot will be the one with elusive, and the 3-mana bot will be the one with tough. That kind of thing. Or make it elusive for 1 turn like Blade Scout. There's a few different things you can do. I don't know if I really like that exact solution. I mean, we'll have to see. Also, it's very possible that even though they say bots in parentheses, that associated cards also includes Flash of Brilliance, which actually wouldn't surprise me at all. Because I think Steve Rubin was saying on Twitter that he had larger concerns with Flash of Brilliance in terms of its interaction with Heimer, if I remember correctly. And this kind of like goes back to the I mean, some of you guys will remember the 6-hour long like game design talk we had. And I mentioned in that talk at the end why I didn't really like the idea of Heimer like switching around bots. For the most part, I think that Heimer's design is just like effectively going to be impossible to balance. And it will always be either kind of like way too weak or way too strong. And I think that this sort of also seems to me to be a bit of a band-aid solution where, you know, it'll fix things and it'll make things good for a little bit, but kind of eventually in the future, you know, you look like 2 patches in the future and maybe 3, and there will come a time where it's kind of like broken again. If you keep doing this sort of thing that like it'll fix it, but kind of like in the future maybe it'll break again. If you spend, you know, let's say 8 patches doing that, then kind of like for the rest of the game's development, there'll be kind of like these whack-a-moles popping up. Game design is just nerdy whack-a-mole. I think that whack-a-mole is a pitfall of game design. Game design shouldn't be whack-a-mole, but I think that if you make mistakes, it will end up turning into a game of whack-a-mole. I think that labs are going to be really cool. The literal most important concept is something like Tavern Brawl from Hearthstone, which is basically what labs is in Runeterra. The idea of a weekly or bi-weekly scheduled new rule set mode concept, right? The reason why I think this is so genius, because I do think this is a genius concept. I really do. Right. I mean, they're net decking it, but that doesn't, you know, whatever. You know what? I did a whole game design thing for 6 hours 3 days ago. I didn't talk about modes at all. And I hate modes. Most modes. Modes are fucking game killers, my friends. You guys have no idea how many games get killed by modes. Like, it's, like, seriously? No idea. I can tell you right now, both Gwent and Artifact were largely killed by modes. Big asterisk, Artifact had a fuck ton of problems on launch. It felt like really incomplete and yeah, economy, yeah. But modes were still like a flaw. Overreact much? No, I'm gonna explain. Modes. So, it's gonna see, I'll talk about Gwent. How the F was Gwent killed by modes? Power Cuties, you haven't heard this talk? I've mentioned this a couple of times. So, it's kind of like, it's the kind of thing that we as players don't really notice. Brief history of Gwent. For about a year and a half, it was looking pretty promising. They released a mode, or sorry, they released a patch called the Midwinter Update. The patch was like largely very much a different design direction for Gwent, and kind of like, the card design of the patch was like very different from normal stuff. And then the game effectively, quote-unquote, died at that point. Which is where, you know, you look at the player base, and a lot of them will say the game died at that point. And I'll say that the game died because at that point they released a bad patch, a bad meta. They made the decision to put the game on ice for like 9 months while they reworked it from scratch. The reason they did this, by the way, is because they fired the lead designer at that time. Because, I mean, there was a producer who really wanted him gone for like years, so he just fired the guy, and then they were like, well, okay, let's get someone else in here, and then let's just like remake this entire thing, and just hope our players will be okay with that. Good stuff. Anyway, that's kind of the whole process on the game dying. Here's the thing. People don't talk about 2 months after this Midwinter Update, the one that like kind of like sort of messed up the card design, they released an arena mode for Gwent. And this was akin to Hearthstone's arena. It was draft. Here's the problem. This is why the update sucked. They literally designed an alternate mode that did not fit their game at all. They designed a draft mode, and by the way, draft could have worked in Gwent. There could have been a draft mode that worked So Gwent is a very high synergy game. They built a draft mode that they literally net decked Hearthstone. They even called it Arena, which didn't even make sense. But draft as a concept could have worked in something like a sealed format like Magic, something like that, or asynchronous draft, right? There could have been formats for it that actually did suit the game. They were playtesting the draft, and they were like, wow, this is really not going to work with how the game is currently designed. We're going to have to change the card pool to make this make sense. This is one of the biggest reasons why Midwinter had such strange card design. The biggest of which being, you know, stuff like the low synergy create effects. Gwent was an incredibly high synergy game, right? Gwent was a game where it's like, your entire deck needs to be kind of like, all of it needs to be working together. And there was like almost no, like, before this point, there was actually almost no value. There was almost no concept of a value deck before this entire point. And this is the kind of like situation where a mode can really end up ruining a game without the players really even realizing it. You know, if you don't go out of your way with design-wise for the mode, then the mode's gonna suck and be completely useless and a waste of development resources. And if you do, then you might end up somewhat making your base game worse. Dota Underlords. You know what? I forgot about it. That was my third example. Dota Underlords was a game that was absolutely fucking destroyed by its own modes. Abso-fucking-lutely ass-pounded by its own modes. And you know what? I forgot about it here. And you know why I forgot about it? Because it got so fucked by its own modes. Like, that game just... It literally just... There, like, the modes were literally most of what killed the game. Actually. Like, which is crazy. It's crazy. Now, that I've kind of explained my thoughts on modes, this is why I like labs. I mean, I'm sure Hearthstone wasn't the first thing ever to do that kind of thing, but it was pretty genius. I fucking love it. I think it does everything that a mode should want to do. A, because it's able to like mix things up on a week-to-week basis, it doesn't, you don't have to go out of your way developmentally to do it at all, right? B, because it is sort of like a fresh thing that you play for like a few days when it comes out and then kind of forget about later, which is, by the way, not a bad thing. It's kind of a good thing that towards the back end of most of these fresh new things, most people don't give a shit about them. It ends up kind of like, instead of dividing your community like some modes do, it ends up literally unifying the community, because like every week there's like a day or two where it's like, oh yeah, this is the thing, and then, you know, we're all back to constructed or whatever after that, right? That's great. That timeline pattern is amazing. You know, it's of course not that hard to come up with a lot of like interesting rule concepts. We've seen like, and don't get me wrong, Tavern Brawl in Hearthstone has had like a lot of pretty dud concepts, but they've had dozens of like pretty fun things. Even the stupidest shit, even the ones that are, and most of them are really fucking like abusable and crazy and breakable, and most of them it takes like sometimes even less than 24 hours for people to figure out like the best possible way to do it. But it's a really great concept. It's great, right? Like, so everything about this mode is kind of like the opposite of what most normal modes are doing in most card games, right? Is Battleground a good mode in Hearthstone? Yeah, I think Battleground's a great mode. I think they, you know, they did an extremely good take on that idea, right? And that's kind of like the big difference, right? The biggest thing is they're not trying to use the same cards for the same mode. That's the biggest thing. They're using the same art, and they're using the same like general concepts, but not most cards in Battlegrounds do literally the same thing as they do in Hearthstone. Some of them do basically the same thing, which is cool, you know, and when they're able to do that, that's neat. But when you're not juggling your entire card pool and adding a second mode to that, like when you're juggling game design and you're like, ooh, yeah, oh, I can do this, let's throw in another mode. You know, I can balance, I can, you know, it doesn't usually work when you have the idea of like the same exact card pool needs to be for this way of playing with cards and deck building, and then this completely different way of playing with cards and deck building. That is what I have a problem with. Battlegrounds doesn't have that flaw. Tavern Brawl and Labs doesn't have that flaw. And those are the kind of modes that are great. So, like, that's amazing. Like, if we're going to use, like, you know, in-game assets that are isolated into an entirely different mode, I love that. But when it's like, when it becomes a juggling act, that is when games die from it, because you can't juggle that many things. And it's not even a matter of skill. With most kinds of like modes that use the same card pool, it does become like, oh, do I want to sacrifice, you know, with each micro decision, do I want to sacrifice fun in this mode or this mode? Like, it becomes a question that doesn't have a right answer. And I'll play it tomorrow. I mean, I'm excited to actually like check out Labs, right?